What is God? Let's just do it. Let's start with the simplicity of a child. What is God, Rabbi?
Well, it depends who you're answering. If you're answering a 2-year-old, you answer one way. But if you're discussing it with an adult, you begin with a recognition, which actually the entire debate should be framed with, of human limitation. In the following sense, when you were 2 years old, could you imagine what it's like to be an adult? Of course not. A 2-year-old has no idea what an adult is like. And yet we make definitive statements about God all the time, when in every religion that I know of, the distance between God and human beings is infinitely greater than the distance between an adult and a 2-year-old. So when I say, as I'm going to in a second, I'm not going to avoid your question, but understand that I say it against the background of a religious recognition of our own inability to understand that which is infinitely greater than ourselves. My thumbnail definition of what God is that God is the source of everything that exists, and God is someone, something with whom a human being can have a relationship, and that you can live your life in alignment with a godly purpose. But any definition that is greater than that is in some ways to traduce God, which is why, by the way, the title of Christopher's book is exactly right. God is not great. Because to say God is great or God is something is to put a definition on God, which we know from classical Jewish philosophy you ought not to do. So in fact, Christopher's exactly right, and we can wrap it up right now.
Apologies perhaps to Muslims in the audience who say God is great all the time. We'll circle back.
Okay.
Chris Hedges, to you.
Well, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that God was dead. And Sigmund Freud can be rendered as having said that God was dad. And I think both of them are probably right. The concept of God is like everything else in our vocabulary, man-made. It's an invention of human beings. Unless you take the view that God made us, in which case it'd be a lot to explain. Why did we in that case make so many gods? It does seem to be very much more probable that men and women made many gods than that any one God made all men and women and the rest of creation. And as well as being man-made, it's fear-made. It is the unexpressed or partially expressed wish for a protector, a parent, someone who will never desert you, someone who will do in a way you're thinking for you, especially on questions of moral philosophy. At its best, it's that. It's a wish to be loved more than you probably deserve. And at its worst, it's the underdeveloped part of the human psyche that leads to totalitarianism, that wants to worship and that wants a boss, that wants a celestial dictatorship. And that's the bit that's now threatening to destroy our secular civilization. And so you're quite right to start where you do. It used to be believed, the number of gods now it's infinite, and a new god is created almost every day by some cult or other, but it used to be that. There was a belief that gods were in the trees, in the woods, in the springs, in the sea, in the clouds, and so forth. Polytheism of a kind. Then something a bit more polytheistic like Olympus, where there was at least a location for the divine, but it was multifaceted. And then monotheism, getting it down to one. So I regard this as progress of a sort, because they're getting nearer the true figure all the time.
I actually...
Rabbi, yes. Progress. Maybe.
Which is why, which by the way is why the Vatican in its old days was very upset by the concept of zero. Didn't like zero at all, the most important number of all, the number without which you can't do anything, which wasn't there in Roman numerals.
No, it was invented in Islamic civilization,
and unfortunately
actually.
also struck them as a sinister import from in partibus infidelium, from pagan lands, but also the concept of zero was very troubling for theism, and must be, and does indeed remain so. It's one of the many, many ways in which theism is not compatible with a scientific worldview.
Rabbi Wolpe, may I ask you?
I just want to point out, without even taking issue with the incorrect statements that he made. But I want you to understand. Wait. I want you to understand the progress of the argument that you just heard, because it's important, and people do this all the time, and at least you should be aware of it, whether you accept it or not. Very often when people argue with you, especially when they argue about religion, they attribute their own beliefs to logic and your belief to psychology. So religious people believe in something because they need to be loved, or they need a crutch, or they're weak. But I believe what I believe because it's true and scientific. And I just want you to be aware that you cannot actually disprove someone's belief by imputing an unworthy motive to it. You actually have to disprove the belief. So don't let Christopher pull the psychological wool over your eyes. You can actually be just as worthy or unworthy of love, just as tough-minded, just as thoughtful, just as deep, and still believe in God, as most human beings have throughout all of human history, as if you are Christopher Hitchens.
Christopher, are you a trickster?
Well, I don't think that you couldn't accuse that of being an incorrect statement. You could accuse it of being an incomplete one. I didn't give all the reasons why people believe in God, but after all, you did write a whole book that argues that the belief in God can be very useful to people in times of crisis. Did you not? I mean, that's and that's
yes, but I never said that that was why you should believe in God.
No, and I don't think it is the reason why many people do. But remember that there are two questions. Well, I better now say, lest I be accused of not having exhausted the entire subject in my first response, I better say there are at least two questions. One is this: is there a God, a creator, a prime mover, an uncaused cause, whatever you like to call it? And this was the question answered at a certain point, not very long ago in our history, by the deists, people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, and many others, who said that the order of the universe seemed to suggest that it couldn't just have been random, that there may have been a designer, but the designer didn't take any part in human affairs. And that, in the late 17th, early 18th centuries was probably, late 18th, early 19th centuries was probably a very intelligent position to hold. It was as far pre-Einstein, pre-Darwin, was probably as far as you were likely to get with philosophical speculation. But so believing that there might be a cause or a mover or a creator is one thing, but believing that there is a supervising, intervening entity who cares who wins the war, who cares who you sleep with and in what way, who cares what you eat and on what day, and in other words, who makes you the center of the whole cosmos, is another thing altogether. So people who say, I believe in God, I'm a deist, have all their work in front of them before they can say that they are really religious.
Are you prepared to be a deist?
No.
No divine mover, even at the, whatever, the origin?
There's nothing in the natural, in the cosmic order, or that's the macro level, or the micro level, that's to say the constituent of our own DNA and the things that we have in common with the other animals, and indeed other forms of life like plants, that isn't susceptible to a much better explanation.
Well, here's...
as the great physicist Laplace said when he demonstrated his working model, his orrery as it's called, of the solar system to the emperor, and Napoleon said, well, I see there's no God in this system, and Laplace said, well, Your Majesty, it works without that assumption.
Rabbi, I don't want to play God, but
Okay.
to give form to this.
Sure.
It's 2010. You said you think of God as the source of all. In the year BCE, 2010, why attribute the source of all to divinity? What about science? And you just said...
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to address. First of all, there are two separate ways of thinking about this, both, and I'll offer them both briefly, and you can decide if both or neither is congenial to you. One is that, of course, you can't equate God and proof for God and discussion of God with a demonstration in a laboratory. That's never been the case. The idea is different, to shift it differently, which is this. I would ask you this question instead. Deep down, do you believe that the universe is constituted only by stuff, by material, or is there a mystery at the heart of things? Do you believe that you are purely synapses, or is there something immaterial and eternal about you and those you love? Do you believe that things like love are just an epiphenomena of the way evolution has put us all together, or do you think there is something that in the fact that immaterial things like ideas and love and consciousness have such a profound influence on our lives that lead you to believe that the intangible can be at least as real or more real than the tangible. If that way of looking at the world appeals to you or speaks to you, then you understand that Laplace, in order to explain how the heavens go, may not need the hypothesis of God, but that in order to explain why there is something rather than nothing, why there is a deeper meaning to life than stuff alone, that's something that speaks to you and lets you understand that God is real. That's part one. Wait. Part two is there are, in fact, things that are suggestive of something greater in even the scientific worldview, which is why, by the way, in the American Academy of Science, more than half consistently, and this has been true for the last 100 years, 52% of scientists say that they believe in God. And that is the fact that everything exists rather than nothing, that consciousness, which is still inexplicable to human beings, is real, that I make sounds, and which is immaterial, and it touches you in some way that makes you want to change things. The way of looking at the world, even from what we can see and touch and feel, suggests that there's something greater than what we know. And now, go right ahead.
I can't paraphrase him properly, but you really ought to get hold of, it's easy to find on Google, a lecture given by Lawrence Krauss, who I regard as the greatest living physicist. And it's about the quantum, and it's about a whole universe from nothing. It's exactly how you get from nothing to something, in fact, quite a lot of things. One means by which this happens is the following. Every second that we're speaking, a star the size of our sun or bigger goes out, blows up or goes out. That's been the case every single second since the first moment of the Big Bang. It's a lot. That'll be a lot of suns going out as we speak. And there's a lot of annihilation, isn't it? There's a lot of destruction. It's a rather what you might call almost a wasteful scale. It does have the positive outcome, though, that we are all constituted of those materials. We are made of stardust. Now, I find that a rather more majestic and wonderful and even beautiful idea than, say, the idea of the burning bush. A bit more impressive. Gives you more to think about.
Are they mutually exclusive? Are they mutually exclusive? Did God make you of stardust?
One has the virtue of being true and provable and studyable, which the other doesn't. And I do think that the verifiability of something is a virtue of
Are we
kind.
simply material then?
Yes. We don't have bodies, we are bodies. Until 50,000 years ago, there were 4 other kinds of biped, humanoid, not unlike us, still living on the planet, died leaving no descendants. We're the only survivors of those people. That family were the last. We don't know if they had gods or not.
So you think the inexplicable...
No religion ever invented appears to have known that these creatures even existed, because the religious are forced to believe that the only really significant event that happened in the human story happened about 3,000 years ago.
Are the mysteries inexplicable? Are we just waiting?
That's not true.
Them?
No, that's factually
all of this massive Big Bang cosmological churning and destruction and annihilation, which is paralleled, by the way, on our own Earth, where 99% of all species that have ever been on the planet have already gone extinct, leaving no descendants. All of this could be part of a plan. There is no way an atheist can prove it's not. But it's some plan, isn't it? With mass destruction, pitiless extermination, annihilation going on all the time, and all of this set in motion on a scale that's absolutely beyond our imagination, in order that the Pope can tell people not to jerk off.
Rabbi?
Stupid. Right. Now, I think here we've reached actually...
It's childish to be.
We've reached an area of agreement. I, too, repudiate that statement by the Pope, and I'm happy to do it publicly. No, wait just a second. Hold on. First of all, it's just not true that religions don't actually acknowledge very important things that happened before their own founding. Just read the beginning of the Bible, which goes back far beyond the founding of the Bible. But more important than that, there are actually things that if you are material, you can't give an accounting of. For example, you might not believe that you have free will. You might think that everything you do was predetermined from the beginning of the Big Bang, and just the fact, by the way, that all of the universe, physics tells us, came from something tinier than the head of a pin is, to me, there is no word other than miraculous for it, but nonetheless. You might believe that everything you did, our words tonight, the fact that those flowers would be orange on the table, that was all predetermined from the beginning of time. But if you believe that you actually make a choice, that human beings have free will, then I ask you how you account for that. You didn't pick your birth, your genetics, you didn't pick your environment, so from the very beginning, all of that was predetermined for you, and unless there is something immaterial about you that allows you to choose, then everything human beings do is already set from the beginning of time. I don't understand how you get free will if you don't have God.
Christopher.
It's pathetic, I'm sorry to say, to say of the cosmological and the genetic that these are deterministic processes. They're not at all. They're full of extraordinary randomness, and in the genetic case of mutation. Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, wrote a book which I recommend to you called The Burgess Shale, which is it's the side of a mountain in Canada, in the Canadian Rockies, that's sheared off. So you can see the inside of a mountain. You can see it as if you're looking at a blackboard, and you can see the growth and development of species, and you realize that it's not a tree, it's more like a bush. There are reverse branches that go off and don't go nowhere, and the others that succeed. And there are different kinds of failure and different kinds of mutation. His most exciting thought, most revolutionary thought, is this. If you could, so to speak, put all that onto a tape and rewind it, and then press play again, there's no certainty it would come out the same way. In fact, there's every reason to believe that it would not. So there's nothing predetermined, there's nothing deterministic about this at all. And thanks to your understanding of our genetics, which are also not predetermined because they're a result of random mutation and natural selection, as everyone now knows, and that's why we can have, sad to say for the kosher, but we can have skin transplants and organ transplants from pigs who are much closer to us than we used to think. We can also sequence the DNA of viruses and learn how to immunize ourselves from them. It works, in other words. But yes, it can be tampered with, it can be engineered, for good as well as for ill. There's nothing deterministic about it at all. It's much more exciting, it's much more interesting, it's much more rewarding, it's verifiable, and yes, there are elements of, I was trying to say, the miraculous, the awe-inspiring, the tragic, the majestic in this, that there simply are not in the incantations of Genesis, where the supposed authors claim to know the divinity, the creator, on personal terms. This is nonsense, it's for children.
Rabbi?
First of all, it is interesting. I mean, Stephen Gould, who was, by the way, very sympathetic to religion and wrote a book called Rocks of Ages, which I also recommend to you, where he said that religion and science don't overlap.
They sure do.
But wait 1 second. If you read his book on the Burgess Shale, he does say if you rewind, then you assume if you push play again, you would get a different result. And that's certainly true unless the result was intended. But more important than that, yes, there's randomness in the system. Nobody would argue that there isn't randomness in the system. But randomness isn't free will. Randomness is getting a result you don't expect. The question is, how do you get a directed choice, which isn't random? I choose right now to pick this glass up. Now, how did I make that choice? If I'm purely a product of my DNA and my environment, then it's not a choice. Then it was programmed in, then it's instinct. And the whole point that religion's always made about instinct was that human beings can rise above it. Unlike animals, which are the same at age 2 as they are at age 10, as they are at age 15, a human being grows and changes and chooses. That's the basis of religious
I have to say, to me, it doesn't seem a matter of religion that I can choose to pick up this class. That seems to me to be well within what could develop purely scientific basis.
How?
I'm not a scientist, but it doesn't seem like a mystery of God to me personally.
Oh, sure it is. Well, no, but seriously, where does the element of free choice come from?
I could be purely instinctual and put my head in a stream and drink and choose to do that.
But wait, when you say choose, when you say choose, where does the choice come from any more than the choice of this glass to fall down? Where do you get a choice as opposed to a complex interaction of DNA and environment, neither of which you chose?
Again, piling on completely unnecessary assumptions. It's also inviting a question that will make you uncomfortable.
Go ahead.
If you say that no, it's because God has given you free will, I have to ask you, how do you know that?
Well, Are you assuming that we have free will? Are you assuming
sure.
that we have free will?
If you answer,
Then give me another source.
If you answer my question with another
Give
question,
me another
I'll still
source.
answer it.
Okay.
I will still answer it, even though your question is an answer to mine. Rather, not an answer, a response to mine.
Yeah.
The view I take about free will is that, of course, we have free will because we have no choice but to have it. I was, and to some extent, I still to some extent am a dialectical materialist, and I also think there are some ironies in the universe as well as in history. But to say, of course we have free will, the boss says we've got it, is to make a mockery of the whole concept. And it's also to invite the question, what kind of tyranny is this that you want? You want an all-supervising, all-deciding person. I ask you first, what sources of information do you have about this person's existence that I don't have, that are denied to me? I'd like to know. And second, why do you want it? Why do you want to arrive at a terminus of unfreedom where there is a celestial authority upon whom all things depend and from which all things flow? Why do you want that, and how on earth do you know that there's any case to be made for its existence?
Yes, please. That's a good question.
I don't think that's a terminus of unfreedom.
I think you're only free when you've declared against it, frankly. That's the beginning of freedom, is the emancipation from the tyranny of theocracy, yes.
I actually think that the whole point that I was making was that a belief in a God who creates you is what gives you free will. And that without it, you have to fall into a determinism. And by the way, you may think that science gives it to you, but every scientist I've asked on this question, including David Barash, who's an evolutionary biologist, says that and Steven Pinker had the same reaction, is that it is more or less a commonplace of modern science, that determinism is the only worldview that's consistent with an understanding of the way science works. So you may be able to find it in science, but I haven't met a scientist yet who's been able to account for it.
Not every scientist is a believer.
Putting that aside. No, of course not. I'm saying that those who don't use determinism as their philosophical assumption, but let me answer his question too, which is, therefore, I assume that as a religious person, you're granted freedom. That's the whole point, is you do make choices.
Once you've said granted.
Better choices.
Once you've said granted, you've made my point.
And he's English. He knows about kings.
You're granted.
Thank you for making me free.
You're granted freedom. So you're granted freedom by the evolutionary process. I'm granted freedom by a creator. Either way, I'm not
granted all sorts of freedom. I mean, of course, scientists are right to this extent. Einstein says the miraculous thing about the laws of nature is they're never suspended. That's what's so amazing about them. They're immutable. Religion claims that on occasions the laws of nature are suspended in order to prove what they wouldn't otherwise prove.
It depends who you ask, not Maimonides. It depends who you ask in religion.
Is there a fundamental contradiction in your mind, Rabbi, between Jewish teaching and evolution?
No.
None at all?
Not. No. None.
But evolution, as we learn it, doesn't require a deity.
No. It depends what you mean by require a deity. It's just like saying that building the stage doesn't require a deity. The question isn't whether the discovery of the mechanism by which God made the world requires God. It just requires the discovery of the mechanism by which God made the world. But it also doesn't outlaw God or make God impossible or make it, in fact, less plausible.
What's the difference, to your mind, between mystery and incomprehension?
Incomprehension.
In other words,
incomprehension describes my reaction to the question.
Oh, great.